It was a crisp autumn morning at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. The terminal buzzed with the usual mix of hurried business people and leisure travelers, all shuffling through their morning routines. Among them walked Admiral James Williams, his footsteps measured and confident after 3 decades of military service. He'd chosen to wear his favorite charcoal gray suit today instead of his uniform. A simple decision that would lead to an extraordinary encounter. The Admiral carried just a small leather briefcase, a habit from years of efficient packing. His silver hair and distinguished bearing turned a few heads, but not for the reasons he was used to. Today, he was just another passenger to most, though one whose varied presence seemed to command a certain respect. As he approached the first-class boarding line, he noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that he'd grown accustomed to over the years. A woman in an expensive business suit clutched her handbag a little tighter. A man in golf attire suddenly became very interested in his phone. The Admiral had seen it all before, but it never ceased to amaze him how people could form judgments in mere seconds. The boarding process began, and the gate agent's smile flickered ever so slightly as she checked his ticket. "First class?" she asked, her tone carrying that familiar note of doubt. The Admiral simply nodded, maintaining the same calm demeanor that had served him well through countless military operations and diplomatic missions. Walking down the jet bridge, he could hear the whispered conversations behind him. "Must be some kind of mistake," someone muttered, not quite quietly enough. The Admiral allowed himself a small smile, knowing what was about to unfold. The plane's interior was warm and inviting, with soft leather seats and the gentle hum of the ventilation system. As he approached his seat in the second row, a flight attendant intercepted him, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Sir, may I help you find your seat?" she asked, emphasizing "your" in a way that suggested she doubted it was in this section. The Admiral reached into his jacket pocket for his boarding pass, the same one he'd shown at the gate just moments ago. The gold-embossed credit card that accidentally peeked out alongside it caught the flight attendant's attention, causing a flicker of uncertainty to cross her face. He'd seen that look before, too, the moment when someone's preconceptions began to crack. Other passengers were boarding now, creating a steady stream of people flowing past his seat. Some did double takes, others stared openly, and a few pretended not to notice him at all. A businessman in an expensive suit, who would be sitting next to him for the next few hours, was standing in the aisle, repeatedly checking his own boarding pass and glancing at the seat numbers with exaggerated concern. The Admiral took his time storing his briefcase in the overhead compartment, each movement deliberate and unhurried. He'd learned long ago that rushing only gave power to other people's prejudices. As he settled into his seat, he could feel the tension building around him, like a rubber band being stretched to its limit. Little did his fellow passengers know that this moment, this seemingly routine first-class boarding, would soon become a powerful lesson in humility, respect, and the danger of making assumptions. The Admiral straightened his tie, not because it needed adjusting, but because it gave him something to do while he waited for what he knew would come next. After all, he hadn't become one of the highest-ranking officers in the Navy by letting other people's misconceptions define his worth. The businessman in the next seat couldn't seem to sit still. He kept fidgeting with his collar, shooting sideways glances at the Admiral while pretending to read something on his phone. Finally, he caught the eye of a passing flight attendant and raised his hand like an impatient schoolchild. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone who was used to getting his way. "I think there might be some confusion with the seating arrangements." He emphasized the word confusion while gesturing vaguely in the Admiral's direction, as if he were pointing out a misplaced piece of luggage rather than a person. The flight attendant, a different one from earlier, approached with a practiced smile. She was younger than the first, maybe in her mid-20s, and her name tag caught the light as she leaned down to hear the businessman's concerns. The Admiral noticed her hands nervously adjusting her uniform as she listened to the businessman's whispered complaints. "Sir," she turned to the Admiral, her voice professional but uncertain. "Would you mind if I double-checked your boarding pass?" Behind her, the businessman wore an expression of smug satisfaction, like someone who'd just caught a party crasher. The Admiral reached into his jacket pocket once again, his movements unhurried and deliberate. He could feel other passengers watching the scene unfold. A couple across the aisle had stopped their conversation mid-sentence. A woman 2 rows ahead had turned around, not even trying to hide her interest in the developing situation. "Of course," the Admiral replied, his voice carrying the same calm authority that had guided thousands of sailors under his command. He handed over his boarding pass, watching as the flight attendant examined it with far more scrutiny than necessary. The paper shook slightly in her hands. The businessman leaned forward, practically peering over her shoulder. "You know," he said loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear, "I've been a Platinum member for 15 years, and I've never seen such a mix-up in first class before." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. The Admiral noticed an older couple exchanging knowing looks, while a man in a golf shirt nodded along with the businessman's words. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin had grown thick with tension, like the heavy air before a storm. The flight attendant glanced between the boarding pass and her seating chart, then back at the Admiral. "Sir, would you happen to have any additional identification?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The businessman's face lit up with vindication. More passengers were settling into their seats now, but many had slowed their movements, obviously interested in how this scene would play out. Some didn't even pretend to be doing anything else, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama in row 2. The Admiral felt a familiar weight in his chest, not anger, but a deep weariness at having to prove himself yet again. He'd faced this same situation in different forms throughout his career, at military galas, in office buildings, at high-end restaurants. Each time, he had 2 choices: to let the moment pass in silent frustration or to turn it into something meaningful. He reached inside his jacket again, this time for a different set of credentials. The businessman was still talking, saying something about proper protocols and membership levels, but his words were about to fade into insignificance. The Admiral's fingers closed around his military ID and his rarely used Admiral's credentials. As he pulled them out, he caught a glimpse of the 4 stars gleaming on the ID card. He remembered the day he received this rank, thinking about how far he'd come and how much further society still needed to go. With calm dignity, he prepared to present his identification, knowing that what happened next would likely leave a lasting impression on everyone in the cabin. The tension in the first-class cabin had reached a breaking point. More passengers had paused their pre-flight routines to watch the scene unfold. A young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Mom, why is everyone staring?" His mother quickly shushed him, but her eyes remained fixed on the situation. The Admiral sat perfectly still, his posture reflecting years of military discipline. He thought back to his early days in the Navy, when a senior officer had told him, "Your calmest moments will be your most powerful." Those words had guided him through countless challenging situations, and they served him well now. The businessman had grown bolder with his apparent audience. "You know," he announced to no one in particular, "there are proper channels for sorting out these kinds of situations." He emphasized the last word as if it carried a special meaning. A few passengers nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Through the gaps between seats, the Admiral could see people in economy class craning their necks to get a better view. The flight attendant still stood in the aisle, his boarding pass trembling slightly in her hand. Her eyes darted between the paper and his face, as if trying to solve a particularly difficult puzzle. An older flight attendant, who seemed to be the cabin supervisor, made her way down the aisle. The whispers had obviously reached the front of the plane. She walked with the confident stride of someone used to handling difficult situations, though she had no idea she was about to walk into something far beyond a typical seating dispute. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice carrying that perfect blend of authority and customer service. The businessman practically jumped at the chance to explain. Yes, there seems to be some confusion about proper seating assignments, he said, gesturing toward the Admiral as if he were pointing out a misplaced bag. The Admiral remained quiet, watching as years of ingrained prejudices played out before him. He'd seen the script before, the assumptions, the sideways glances, the carefully worded suggestions that he might be in the wrong place. His military ID felt heavy in his hand, like a key waiting to unlock a door of understanding. A woman across the aisle was pretending to read a magazine, but her eyes hadn't moved from the same page for several minutes. Two businessmen near the front had paused their conversation about stock prices to watch. Even the flight crew moving through their pre-flight checks kept finding reasons to pass by row 2. The Admiral thought about his journey, from a small town in the south to the highest ranks of the U.S. Navy. He thought about the young sailors under his command, especially those who might face similar situations in their own lives. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been judged before being known. The younger flight attendant had started apologizing for the delay to nearby passengers, her voice carrying a nervous edge. "We'll have this sorted out momentarily," she assured them, though she didn't sound very sure herself. The businessman was now thumbing through his phone, presumably looking for the customer service number for the airline's premium membership program. The cabin supervisor took the boarding pass from her colleague, examining it with the same excessive scrutiny. "Sir," she addressed the Admiral, her tone professionally neutral but carrying an undertone of doubt, "could you please provide some additional identification?" The Admiral looked around the cabin one last time. He saw the faces of people who had already decided who he was and where he belonged. He saw others who looked uncomfortable with the situation but remained silent. He saw the flight attendants, caught between their training and their assumptions. With the same steady hands that had guided ships through storms and signed orders that affected thousands of lives, he prepared to present his credentials. The moment of truth was approaching, and with it, a lesson about judgment that none of these passengers would soon forget. Time seemed to slow down as the Admiral reached into his jacket pocket. The cabin supervisor stood waiting, her hand extended expectantly. The businessman had stopped scrolling through his phone, his attention now fully focused on what was about to happen. Even the constant background noise of boarding seemed to dim, as if the plane itself was holding its breath. With careful movements, the Admiral pulled out his credentials. First came his military ID, its laminated surface catching the overhead lights. Then, almost casually, he produced his Admiral's identification card, complete with its distinctive 4-star insignia. He handed both cards to the cabin supervisor, maintaining the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the entire encounter. The change in the cabin supervisor's face was immediate and dramatic. Her professional mask slipped for just a moment as her eyes widened in recognition. She looked at the credentials, then at the Admiral, then back at the credentials again. Her hands, which had been so steady moments before, began to tremble slightly. I'm so sorry, Admiral," she stammered, her voice carrying a mix of shock and embarrassment. The words Admiral seemed to echo through the cabin. The younger flight attendant, who was still standing nearby, took a sharp breath. Her hand flew to her mouth as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. The businessman, who had been so vocal just moments before, suddenly became very interested in his shoes. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking rather pale under the harsh cabin lights. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The expensive watch on his wrist clicked loudly in the sudden silence as he nervously adjusted it. Other passengers' reactions rippled through the cabin like a wave. The woman with the magazine finally dropped all pretense of reading, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. The couple who had been whispering and pointing earlier sank lower in their seats. The little boy who had asked about the staring earlier tugged his mother's sleeve again and loudly whispered, "Mom, what's an Admiral?" The cabin supervisor was still holding the credentials as if they might disappear if she loosened her grip. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience or disrespect," she said, her professional training kicking back in, though her voice still shook slightly. "We are honored to have you aboard with us today." The Admiral simply nodded, extending his hand to retrieve his identification. "No apology necessary," he said, his voice carrying the same calm authority it had held throughout the entire incident. "Though I trust my seat assignment won't be questioned further." He added this last part with just the slightest raise of his eyebrow. The younger flight attendant had started apologizing too, her words tumbling out in a rush. Behind her, other crew members who had gathered to watch the scene quickly dispersed, suddenly finding urgent tasks that needed their attention at the other end of the plane. Through the gaps between seats, passengers in economy class who had been watching the drama unfold were now whispering to each other, the news of an admiral's presence spreading quickly through the cabin. A few people had even pulled out their phones, though they quickly put them away when they caught the cabin supervisor's stern glance. The businessman, who had finally found his voice, cleared his throat. "Sir, I mean," he stuttered, but the Admiral raised his hand slightly, cutting off the attempted apology. The gesture was small, but carried the weight of decades of command. The businessman fell silent immediately, his face flushing red with embarrassment. As the Admiral carefully returned his credentials to his jacket pocket, he could feel the atmosphere in the cabin shifting. The earlier tension was being replaced by something else, a mix of embarrassment, respect, and maybe, just maybe, a lesson learned. The 4 stars on his credential card had done more than just confirm his seat assignment. They had shattered assumptions and prejudices in a way that no words could have accomplished. The silence that fell over the first-class cabin was deeper than before, but entirely different in nature. Gone was the tension of judgment, replaced by a heavy blanket of collective embarrassment. The cabin supervisor still stood in the aisle, clutching her hands together as if unsure what to do with them now that they were empty of the Admiral's credentials. A flight attendant appeared with a fresh cup of coffee, placing it carefully on the Admiral's armrest. "Complimentary, of course, sir," she said softly, her cheeks still flushed. Another quickly followed with a warm towel and today's newspapers. The sudden burst of attention made the earlier suspicion seem even more glaring by contrast. The businessman beside the Admiral had developed an intense fascination with the safety card in his seat pocket, studying it as if it contained the secrets of the universe. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely, replaced by an almost painful awkwardness. Every few seconds, he would open his mouth as if to speak, then think better of it and return to his pretend reading. Around the cabin, other passengers were having similar reactions. The couple who had been whispering earlier were now avoiding looking in his direction entirely, their heads turned so far toward the windows that they must have been getting neck cramps. The woman with the magazine had finally put it away, but was now rummaging through her purse with unnecessary thoroughness. The little boy from earlier, however, remained refreshingly honest in his curiosity. "Mom," he stage whispered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "is he like the captain of the whole ocean?" His mother tried to quiet him, her face reddening, but the Admiral couldn't help but smile. It was the first genuine interaction he had since boarding. The cabin supervisor was still hovering nearby, clearly struggling between her desire to make amends and her training about not disturbing first-class passengers. "Sir, please let us know if there's anything at all you need during the flight," she said, her voice carrying the weight of sincere regret. Through the gaps in the seats, passengers in economy class were still craning their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the high-ranking military officer whose presence had caused such a stir. Whispered conversations rippled through the plane like waves, carrying fragments of 4-star Admiral. And can you believe it? An older gentleman, a few rows ahead, stood up and turned around, revealing a veteran's pin on his lapel. He caught the Admiral's eye and offered a crisp salute, which the Admiral acknowledged with a respectful nod. This small exchange seemed to break some of the tension, reminding everyone that beneath the ranks and credentials was a lifetime of service to the country. The businessman finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, I want to apologize for my behavior," he said, staring straight ahead. "I made assumptions that is, I was—" He trailed off, seemingly unable to find the right words to address his earlier actions. The Admiral watched as the man struggled with his apology, noting how differently he carried himself now compared to just minutes ago. The expensive watch he'd been so proud to display earlier now seemed to weigh heavy on his wrist. His platinum membership card, which he'd been ready to wave around as proof of his importance, stayed tucked away in his pocket. As the last few passengers made their way to their seats in economy, the Admiral could feel the eyes of the entire plane on him. But these looks were different from the suspicious glances earlier. There was respect now, yes, but also shame, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, recognition, not just of his rank, but of their own prejudices that had been laid bare by this incident. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the Admiral noticed the young flight attendant lingering nearby, straightening items that didn't need straightening. He could see the questions in her eyes, mixed with embarrassment and curiosity. Finally, she gathered her courage and approached. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "I just wanted to say that I'm truly sorry about earlier. I should have—" Her voice trailed off as she struggled to find the right words. The Admiral smiled warmly, immediately putting her at ease. "You know," he said, his voice carrying the gentle tone of a teacher rather than the sharp edge of accusation, "in my 30 years of service, I've learned that every difficult moment carries a lesson." He gestured to the empty jump seat beside him. "Would you like to hear about one of my first days at the Naval Academy?" The flight attendant glanced around quickly, then sat down. Other passengers nearby quieted their conversations, clearly interested but trying not to appear too obvious about listening. Even the businessman next door had stopped pretending to read his safety card. "I was just 18, the Admiral continued, walking across campus in my new uniform. I was so proud that day, thinking about all the history I was now part of." He paused, letting a small smile cross his face at the memory. Then an older officer stopped me. He looked at my uniform, looked at my face, and asked to see my ID. He was convinced I must be wearing a costume. The flight attendant's hand flew to her mouth. "What did you do?" she asked, completely caught up in the story. By now, several other passengers had given up any pretense of not listening. "The same thing I did today," the Admiral replied. "I showed him my ID, stayed calm, and remembered that change happens one person at a time." He glanced around the cabin, making brief eye contact with several passengers. "That officer later became one of my strongest supporters at the Academy. Sometimes people just need a moment to adjust their perspective." The businessman, who had been silent since his attempted apology, cleared his throat. "How do you do it?" he asked quietly. "How do you stay so composed when people treat you unfairly?" The Admiral considered the question carefully. "I think about the young sailors under my command," he said. "Every time I handle a situation like this with dignity, I'm showing them it's possible to rise above prejudice, that their dreams of serving at the highest levels aren't just dreams." A woman across the aisle wiped a tear from her eye. The older veteran, a few rows ahead, nodded in understanding. The little boy who had asked about the captain of the ocean was listening with wide-eyed attention. "You see," the Admiral continued, "leadership isn't just about giving orders or wearing stars on your uniform. It's about how you handle the moments that test your character. Every person in this cabin today is part of a larger story. A story about how we see each other and how we can choose to be better." The flight attendant dabbed at her eyes with a cocktail napkin. "I'll never forget this flight," she said softly. "Or this lesson." "That's all any of us can do," the Admiral replied. "Learn from each moment and carry those lessons forward." He glanced out the window as the plane began to taxi. "You know, in the Navy, we have a saying. A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. Sometimes the rough waters we face help us become who we're meant to be. The cabin had fallen completely silent now, every passenger absorbed in their own thoughts. The businessman was staring straight ahead, but his expression suggested he was seeing things differently than he had just an hour ago. The couple who had been whispering earlier were now holding hands, their faces reflecting deep thought. As the flight reached cruising altitude, something remarkable had happened in the first-class cabin. The earlier tension had transformed into an atmosphere of openness and genuine conversation. The businessman who had been so confrontational earlier was now engaged in a thoughtful discussion with the Admiral about his journey through the ranks of the Navy. "I never thought about how many barriers you had to break," he admitted, his voice carrying a new note of humility. 30 years of service, that must have started in the early 90s. The Admiral nodded, sharing stories about his early days when seeing a person of color in command was rare enough to make headlines. Other passengers had joined the conversation too. A young professional woman spoke up from across the aisle, sharing her own experiences with prejudice in the corporate world. The older veteran, a few rows ahead, turned around completely in his seat, adding stories from his time in service and how much things had changed, and how much they hadn't. The little boy who had been so curious earlier had moved to sit closer, with his mother's permission. "Did you really command big ships?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. The Admiral smiled, pulling out his phone to show a few photos of the vessels under his command. Soon, a small group had gathered, looking at pictures of massive aircraft carriers and listening to stories about life at sea. The cabin supervisor, who had been devastated by her earlier role in the incident, returned with fresh coffee for everyone involved in the conversation. She stayed to listen as the Admiral described the responsibility of commanding thousands of sailors from all walks of life. "The sea doesn't care about the color of your skin," he said. "Out there, it's about competence, courage, and character." One passenger, a teacher from Minnesota, asked if she could share this story with her students. "They need to hear about moments like this," she explained. "They need to know that change is possible, even if it comes one conversation at a time." The Admiral gave his permission, understanding that this incident had grown beyond just a personal experience. As the flight progressed, several passengers pulled out their phones, making notes or sending messages about their experience. The businessman, who had undergone perhaps the most visible transformation, asked if he could connect with the Admiral on social media. "I want to share what I learned today," he said quietly. "My followers need to hear this story." By the time the plane began its descent, the story had already started spreading. A passenger's social media post about witnessing the incident had gone viral. News outlets were picking up the story, recognizing its power as a teaching moment about prejudice and dignity in modern America. The Admiral's response to discrimination would soon be used in diversity training programs across the country. Military leadership courses would cite it as an example of turning confrontation into education. Corporate workshops would reference it when discussing unconscious bias and professional behavior. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the people who were there that day. The flight attendants would go on to share the story with their colleagues, creating a ripple effect throughout the airline industry. The businessman would later write a LinkedIn post about the experience that would be shared thousands of times, inspiring others to confront their own biases. As the plane touched down and passengers prepared to disembark, the Admiral received something unexpected: a standing ovation from the entire first-class cabin. It wasn't just applause for his military service, but recognition of the grace and wisdom with which he had handled a difficult situation. The little boy, still full of curiosity, gave him a hand-drawn picture of a ship he had sketched during the flight. "When I grow up," he declared, "I want to be just like you." The Admiral carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his jacket pocket, right next to the credentials that had started it all. He knew that somewhere in that cabin, perhaps in that very moment, the cycle of prejudice had been broken for at least one person.